And good evening yet again. We're going to get into Thursday nights in Revelation. We're going to keep looking at the passage, just one verse, Revelation 13:1, and we're looking at this complex individual on which so much of the end times focuses on. He's popularly called the Antichrist. In Revelation, he's the beast that comes from the sea. You see him as the little horn. He's the man of sin, the lawless one. He's described numerous ways in scriptures. But we're going to look at another passage of scripture that points to him and gives us a little bit more of not just a confirmation of what we're talking about, but also looking at it from another angle. So we're going to be in Daniel tonight. We're going to go back to Daniel. Last week we looked at chapter 7. Tonight we're going to look at chapter 8. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, nope, that's not what I wanted to share. Picked the wrong screen. There we go. There we go, much better. Okay, move the window over to the side there. Good. All right, so we're going to kind of go through this. We're not going to read the entire thing all at once, but we're going to go bit by bit and go through and explain this a little bit. Tonight is going to be really heavy with history, so you have to really understand it. As I describe this, I almost feel like Charles Dickens, saying Jacob Marley was dead to begin with. You have to understand this. You have to understand the history of this passage in order for all of it to make sense. So Daniel, remember, is the one that's receiving this vision, and Daniel is living in Babylon, and this is during the time of the exile of the southern kingdom. And so this is around in the 500s BC. And so what he's getting is a look to the future. And this future, you remember, is going to be silent as far as any prophetic voice from God for 400 years. So most of this, all of this is going to be taking place in what's called the interbiblical period. And that's the period between the last word that Malachi said and the appearance of John the Baptist onto the scene. So there's over 400 years in between. And here within those 400 years is history that just flips the world upside down. And so it's important to understand what's taking place in here, and you're going to see how it runs a parallel track to what's going to be taking place in the end times in the 7 years of tribulation. So that's kind of where we're going to go. And so as we go through this chapter, we're going to walk through this history as far as the kingdoms that came and went. We're in what God calls the time of the Gentiles. All right, so this is when the Gentiles are all in rule. And that began when Nebuchadnezzar came to the throne and conquered Judah and burned the temple down and exiled the Jews. Okay, so the time of the Gentiles began then, and the time of the Gentiles is going to continue until the Lord Jesus comes back. So in between that time is the time of the Gentiles. So yes, we are in the time of the Gentiles now. And so that's been taking place now for 2,500 years. So with all of that, now we'll get into chapter 8, verse 1. So it says there, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Now stop a minute. You remember who Belshazzar was. He was the guy, the last king of Babylon, who saw the writing on the wall by the finger. The 3 words that were written there, many, many tekel upperson. And Daniel came in and said, I don't want your rewards or anything, because you don't have much longer to last on this kingdom. And then that night, Darius came in and overthrew Babylon. So that's Belshazzar. Belshazzar was in the 3rd year of his reign. So Daniel puts a timestamp there. A vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time, which was in chapter 7. Verse 2, I saw in the vision, and so it happened when I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Verse 3, then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram with 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. Okay, so here's a ram, and if you remember back in chapter 7, Daniel saw 4 beasts, and one of the beasts was a bear. Okay, and that bear raised up, and it had 3 ribs, and it raised up on one side. Okay, this ram is paralleling that bear. Okay, so this ram has 2 horns, very important to understand, but notice one is higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. This is referring to the next kingdom after after Babylon, which was the Medo-Persian Empire. And the 2 horns represent the Medes and the Persians. The Persians rose to power after the Medes, and then they became greater and more powerful. So you see the 2 horns are coming up, the Medes, the Persians, but the Persians got higher. That's the horn that's rising up higher than the other, and it's the one that came up second. Okay, so that's what's happening here with this ram. It represents the Medes and the Persians. How do I know this? Either I'm really, really smart, or I peeked ahead. And I peeked ahead, but we'll get into that in a little bit. All right, it just sounds like I really know what I'm talking about if I just tell you that right now. But notice here in verse 4, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. Now, notice the 3 directions: westward, northward, and southward. Which directions left out? East. The Medo-Persian Empire didn't expand east. It expanded north, south, and west. It pushed out those different ways in those different directions. And they became powerful. They were a superpower. No animal could withstand them. There wasn't any country that could stand in their way. So Daniel's considering this ram, very powerful ram, and then he gets to verse 5. And as I was considering this, suddenly a male goat came from the west. Okay, important direction from the west. This is a reference to Greece. Okay, now Greece back in chapter 7 was a leopard, moved swiftly, moved rapidly. So the male goat comes from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. See the quickness, see the speed, not even touching the ground, just moving like an airline, just moving like a jet. And notice here that the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. That's referring to Alexander the Great. Okay, so notice what happens next. Verse 6, he came to the ram which had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Okay, so again, it's pointing to Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great is again moving in. This is about in the 300s, 4th century BC, and he is this large horn. Okay, so if you remember, Alexander was conquering for only 11 years, and then he died at a young age. So he conquered a huge amount of land, huge amount of territory in a span of 11 years. And so he moved quickly, he moved fast, and he was thorough. So he was this large horn. So notice what happens to the horn now. Verse 8, therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. And in place of it, 4 notable ones came up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, so after Alexander died, his kingdom, his empire was divided up between his 4 generals. Alexander didn't leave an heir. He had no children, had no son, had no heir. And so the kingdom then was divided up among his four generals. First one was named Cassander, and he took more to the north and the west. He took Macedonia and Greece. Lysimachus took Asia Minor or Turkey. Seleucus took Syria and Babylonia. And then Ptolemy took Egypt, he took Arabia, and he took the Palestine region. Now, Palestine was going to be the big point of contention. So ultimately what happened was Cassander and Lysimachus kind of faded from view. They weren't strong leaders. And so the land that they had, the part of the empire that they had kind of dissolved and kind of splintered off and ultimately got sucked up and consolidated by Rome. But Seleucus and Ptolemy rose in power. They became very strong. And you can read about the back and forth between the two of them in Daniel 11. And so the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire went back and forth, and they were taking control of Palestine, one and then the other, back and forth constantly. Okay, so those are the 4 horns. Those are the 4 notable ones that came up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Okay, and so the ones that we have to really pay attention to are Seleucus and Ptolemy, and especially Seleucus. That's going to be the one that we're really going to lean into the further we get into chapter 8. So again, timeline wise, this is towards we're getting closer to 300 BC, and we're going to be moving on from about 300 into 150. So for the next 150 years, we're going to see this back and forth between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Okay, so now we go to verse 9. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. Okay. A couple of things to note here. Number one is that here's a little horn again.
And you go to the next one.
Okay, just like in chapter 7, we have a little horn. Okay, and this little horn, remember the little horn in chapter 7 was boasting, running at the mouth, talking all sorts of stuff about how great he was and how he was God-like and how he was God, all these kind of blasphemous things. So here is this, again, here's this little horn that's growing up, exceedingly great. Notice the directions toward the south, now towards the east, and towards the glorious land. The glorious land here is referring to Israel. It's referring to Palestine. It's referring to the area surrounding Jerusalem.
You should have worn a colored shirt.
Okay, so moving forward there, that's where this little horn is. Now we're going to focus on this little horn. Now, verse 10, it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. Okay, so again, we're going to be talking about this little horn. Now, what's fascinating about this little horn is that it's going to have 2 fulfillments. And when you go back again to the 4 generals, we're focusing on Seleucus. His successors included a number of guys named Antiochus. There was Antiochus the first, there was Antiochus the second, there was Antiochus the third, and we're going to be focusing especially on Antiochus the fourth. Antiochus the fourth is also called Antiochus Epiphanes, which means great one. And this is the guy, this is going to be the identity of the little horn immediately in terms of what is about to happen in Israel and in the Holy Land. Okay, but stay with me because there's gonna be a plot turn, and there's gonna be a big pivot in the plot, and it's gonna all come together as to how this relates to Revelation. Okay, so just stay with me, and if you have questions, throw up a hand and let me know so we can stop and we can track back and answer questions. Okay, so notice here that it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. And this is referring to Antiochus's hostilities and persecution of the Jews. He was rough with them, he was cruel with them, and he not only subjugated them, but he was brutal with them. Okay, so keep that in mind, and we'll get some more explanation later on. Verse 11, he even exalted himself as high as the Prince of Hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now, verse 12, then, because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. So what we're going to find is Antiochus had put an end, at some point he put an end to the Jews offering sacrifices in their newly rebuilt temple. He put a stop to it. And then notice what he does in verse 12. He cast truth down to the ground, and he did all this, and he prospered. So he was successful in all that he was endeavoring to do. Now notice verse 13. I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said that to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? Now we're going to go over a lot of what Antiochus did that got everybody so riled up, and what he did that was so horrible. But you'll see this, and hopefully this is all going to come together here. Verse 14 says, and he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. So that's roughly 6 years. And there's some scholars that point out that Antiochus's rule lasted for just a little over 6 years. So there's a fulfillment there. Okay, so that's the vision. Daniel just reports the vision. Okay, now we've got a little bit of an idea of what's taking place. So now we're in Daniel's spot in verse 15. Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning. Daniel didn't know what it all meant. He was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. Verse 16, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, the river, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So the angel Gabriel comes and is going to now explain this entire vision to Daniel, all the things that he saw. I find that rather helpful because otherwise we're kind of left to our own imaginations and our own guesstimates as to how this is going to be, what this refers to, what it means, and how it was going to be fulfilled, if it's been fulfilled, and how on earth it relates to Revelation. We would be at a loss were it not for Gabriel. So thank you, Lord, for sending Gabriel to make this man understand. So verse 17, so he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Interesting. Verse 18, now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. but he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. Now, this time of the indignation is the time of the Gentiles that I spoke about. It's the time of wrath. Okay, so this began at the time that Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah, conquered Jerusalem, and took the Jews into exile in Babylon. This is the time of the indignation. And this is going to happen in the latter time of the indignation. In other words, later on, but not necessarily at the very end. Although we're going to see that there's going to be a dual fulfillment here. Okay, so he says this, for at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram, he says in verse 20, which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, so there's the two-horned ram. Gabriel comes right out and tells us it's the Medo-Persian Empire. Thank you, Gabriel. That helps a lot. And then he says, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. Well, that's very helpful. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. So Alexander now is going to rise up. He is going to be that first great king, and he is going to begin his rule in around 334, and he'll go till about 323. And in 323, Alexander died, it says, of malaria and complications from alcohol. He was an alcoholic, all of the age of 32. So when he died, verse 22, the four horns that came from that, his horn was broken, and so the four generals came in. And again, their names were Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. And remember, Cassander and Lysimachus kind of fade off the scene, and the ones that we really focus on are Ptolemy and Seleucus. Okay, so understanding that we're really just focusing on two generals helps a lot. Okay, so Gabriel tells us that going up there. So that's where we are coming up to verse 23. And verse 23 begins the real crux of this whole discussion. So up to this point, let me see if you have any questions, if there's something that doesn't make sense or is not registering.
A lot.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Why couldn't Daniel's vision just say the Medes and the Persians? Why do we have to see the goats and the horns? And do you know what I mean? It seemed like it would have been easier just to tell it flat out instead of without all of the, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess the thing I would say is, the thing that comes to mind that's similar is Jesus telling stories about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven in parables.
Mm-hmm.
And you wonder why are you telling a bunch of stories?
Yeah.
And part of the reason was for that point is that there were a lot of people that weren't really dialed into the things of God. They really weren't seeking God. And if they really weren't serious about seeking God, it would just be a story to them and they wouldn't understand. But the ones that were really seeking God would ask questions. They'd probe more. They'd wrestle with it more. They'd want to know more. So it's more of a draw you out and bring you in and let you grapple with this. And so I think that maybe that's part of the reason of all this imagery that the prophets would see, is that they would see this, it would captivate them, it would startle them, they wouldn't understand what it means, but they're writing it down because they know it's important, even though they don't understand what it means. And maybe that in that capsule, because they're just trying to describe what they're observing, they're focused on that. I suspect that if you started telling me the future as I'm trying to write down what I'm witnessing, and you're telling me what's going to happen next, I'm not really going to pay attention to what I'm noticing right now, because I'm going to be so focused on what you're saying next. And I'm going to miss some important points, because you'll hit me with one and you're going to say, wait, this guy, especially if you tell me there's a king and he's not going to last very long. He's going to be a great king, swift king, and he's going to conquer the earth, Alexander the Great, and he's going to die at age 32. Wait, what? Why is he dying at age 32? And meanwhile, you're telling me, and there's going to be his 4 generals that are going to take over after that, and 2 of them aren't going to be that powerful, but 2 are, and it's going to go on, and it's really going to come down to Antiochus Epiphanes. Wait, what? It's kind of like, even now, as we're trying to go through this and explain it, it feels like we're drinking from a fire hose, because we're filling in blanks, and we're looking at these images and saying, all right, this refers to this person and this refers to this person. Sometimes you feel like, whoa, wait, whoa, lots of people moving around here. So that would be my guess.
Okay. Makes us have to work harder at figuring it out.
It makes us wrestle, and a lot of times that's what the Lord makes us do to know him better. We have to wrestle. Sometimes we got to get down in the mud, down in the dirt, and really get after it to know more about it. So I think that may be part of it. Okay. But yeah, I've kind of wished he would just cut to the chase and say, all right, here's what's going to happen, and line it out for me. But it's not how their minds worked either back then. That Eastern mind did not think that way. They were more of stories and imagery, more so than we are. We're more of the Western mind that, give us a timeline, give us a date, on such and such a date, this is going to happen. That's not how they thought. If we'd have done something like that to them, they'd have said, wait, what? Who? What? I don't care about that. What's happening? Who is this guy? Wait, who is this guy? So I think there's that to consider too.
Thank you.
That's good. All right. Anyone else? Any other observations, questions, comments? Nope, we're all good. All right, because 23, okay, buckle up, hands and arms inside the car at all times. This is going to get kind of crazy here in verse 23. All right, Gabriel continues with his explanation. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise. All right, so here is Antiochus Epiphanes. All right, he's coming to power. He's Antiochus the Fourth. He comes to power in 175 BC. And in 5 years later, as Antiochus is ruling over his territory, Ptolemy the Sixth of Egypt, remember the 2 sides, Seleucus and Ptolemy. All right, Antiochus is a Seleucid. Ptolemy is down in Egypt. He comes back, Ptolemy does, to try to take back some of the territory that Antiochus had picked up. And so Antiochus turns around and retaliates by invading Egypt and defeating Ptolemy and declaring that he's now the king of Egypt. And so he grows this way. And this is, if you go back to verse 9, this is his growth in the power to the south. In verse 9 of chapter 8, he says, and out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So here's the growth to the south. All right. So as he's coming back from conquering Egypt, now trouble breaks out in Jerusalem. So he decides, Antiochus IV does, to go into Jerusalem and put down the rebellion. And this is the beautiful land. This is the glorious land that's mentioned in verse 9. Okay, so he goes there and conquers the people, and he goes even further. He desecrates the temple, and he takes all the goodies, all the loot, all the money, all the valuables out of the temple. So he goes back from Jerusalem now to Egypt. However, Rome forces him out of Egypt. So he's coming back, and he decides, Antiochus does, he's going to make Israel his kind of buffer place. He's going to make that the safe zone between himself and Egypt. He's not going to let Egypt come and attack him way up in Syria. So Israel, that glorious land, is going to kind of be the neutral zone. So if they come in there, then that's going to be an act of aggression, and he's going to attack them. So what he does to make that happen, he goes and attacks Jerusalem, burns it, killing multitudes and multitudes of people. And that's where chapter 8, verse 10 says, it grew to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled it. Antiochus did all of that. Okay, so there's the fulfillment of verse 10. So he kills all sorts of people out of Jerusalem there. And then he prohibits the Jews from observing the Sabbath, from observing all of the feasts, and from their sacrifices. He forbids them to circumcise their children. And that comes from verse 11. He even exalted himself as high as the Prince of Hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So Antiochus stopped all Jewish practice at that point. And so he set up altars to idols all throughout Egypt. And then here's the big date for Jew. If the Jews had a date that would live in infamy, it would be December 16th, 167 BC. And it was then that the Jews were ordered by Antiochus to offer up unclean sacrifices, including pigs, and to eat pork. If they didn't, they were going to be penalized by dying. And that was the last straw. And that led to the Maccabean revolt. That led to the Maccabean rebellion. Okay, so that's the king. Notice again some of the description here in verse 23. He has fierce features, and he understands sinister schemes. So all of this stuff, he was very sinister, he was very shrewd, he was very cunning in his political maneuvers. You know, he conquers Egypt, Rome kicks him out of Egypt. All right, well, I'm not going to let Ptolemy and the Egyptians come after me, so I'm going to make Israel, the promise and the glorious land, a buffer zone, so that I'll have at least, you know, that is a no man's land that I can go back and fight and attack. So he goes and wipes all of them out. He's fierce with this. Now, it says in verse 24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully. Antiochus did all of that, and shall prosper and thrive. He certainly did that. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. And he did that when he went through and razed Jerusalem, and he slaughtered people. Now, verse 25, through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. And he shall exalt himself in his heart, which is why he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, the illustrious one, the great one. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. Now, here's some of the other things about this. And here's where, and I'm going to come back to verse 25, and we'll make the big pivot here. But remember that it was 2,300 evenings or 2,300 days 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Okay, so we're trying to put a number there. That's roughly 6 years. Okay, 6 years doesn't equate to anything outside of 6 years. However, there are some scholars that look at that 2,300 and point out that this could refer to 2,300 daily sacrifices. And the daily sacrifices were 2 a day. There was an evening sacrifice and a morning sacrifice. Okay, so if you understand this, then here's where it comes. Alexander or Antiochus desecrated those daily sacrifices 2 times a day. And if that's the case, then you're down to 1,150 days, or 3 years of 360 days each, plus another 70 days. So this is the time from the time that Antiochus desecrated the temple to the refurbishing of it in 164. So 167 to 164, you've got roughly 3 years, and even into 163, when it was fully restored, you have 3.5 years. Okay, so what we're talking about there is a 3.5 year period. And so what's interesting with that is that there's that 3.5 year era that's found in Antiochus. Now, here's where the big pivot comes. Notice in verse 25, let's go back and read this again. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. Now, prince of princes is where we're going to focus. Who would that sound like to you?
Jesus.
Who would be the King of Kings, Lord of Lords,
Jesus.
Prince of Princes? All right, so if that's the case, then this prophecy here in Daniel 8 refers to more than just to Antiochus. It's referring to 2 people. And that second person is that little horn of chapter 7, who is the beast of the sea in Revelation 13. So we're talking about the Antichrist. Now let's go back and look at the parallels, the similarities here in starting in verse 23. In the latter time of their kingdom, when transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Okay, he's going to be fierce in the last 3.5 years of his reign, isn't he? And he understands sinister schemes. I mean, he became the world leader and did so very cunningly, very shrewdly, and he rose to power. Verse 24, take a look at this. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Where did this guy get his power? In Revelation 13. Be from Satan, wouldn't it? Be from the dragon. So he's getting his authority, his power from some other source too. Notice he also will destroy fearfully. And that especially happens during the last 3.5 years. And he shall prosper and thrive. And he shall destroy the mighty, but he will also destroy the holy people. And that's speaking specifically to the last 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. Notice in verse 25, he's described as being cunning, and he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. The biggest deceit is this ruse that he is God. And notice he does this. He exalts himself in his heart and destroys many in their prosperity. But notice then, finally, verse 25, he shall be broken without human means. So in other words, he's not going to be defeated by any human army. It's going to take an act of God. And that's exactly what's going to happen in Revelation 19. So I don't know how well I did in explaining that. Let me back up and see where you might have questions.
Yeah. The Antichrist was taken care of when the Lord came, Jesus came from heaven on his white horse.
Okay. That would be he shall be broken without human means. That's when that'll be fulfilled, isn't it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But I find it remarkable that there are prophecies like this that have double meanings, that have dual fulfillments. All of this was fulfilled with Antiochus IV. It's going to be fulfilled a second time with the one that's popularly called the Antichrist. Okay. Other questions? I either just totally amazed you and just explained it perfectly, or I just left you with, what did you just say?
It is a lot to absorb. But I was wondering that the Antichrist still came into battle against Israel, and he received a fatal wound, and he died. But then I read where the second beast revived him. Now, it's hard to believe, but he had to be revived.
Yeah.
The false prophet, as I'm speaking of.
Yeah. Right. Yep. Yep, that's what happened.
I like when it says not by human means, because God always intervenes. When things are bad, you know that he's going to intervene, especially when it's against the Prince of Peace.
Yeah, and you bring up something that's even greater, thinking about it, just taking it even further. It's not as though the Lord was not directly involved in all of this. It's not as though he says, oh, all right, it's gone far enough, now I'm going to step in. He's been guiding all of this and controlling all of this. Even when you go back to Antiochus, I mean, you think about what purpose Antiochus served in what he did and how he pressed on the Jews so hard, and he took away all of their sacrificial system, and he didn't let the boys be circumcised, and then he went and made the people eat pork and sacrifice pigs on altars, and he did that in the most holy place, and that was the worst of the worst, and that was termed the abomination that causes desolation. How dare you sacrifice an unclean animal in that most holy place? Oh, it was awful, terrible.
Mhm.
What came about from that was a greater conviction, a greater resolution on the part of the Jews that they were not going to wander off and get into idolatry like their ancestors did. They never went down that road again as far as worshiping pagan deities. Now, where they kind of went off the rails on the other side is that they began to worship the law, they began to worship their traditions, they began to worship their extra writings that explained what the law said you could do and what you couldn't do. And those were the things that when Jesus came to earth, he pushed against it. But God used that to get them ready, to get them in a position to where they would be so dialed into the law and so dialed into the scriptures, so that when he came to earth, he was able to point them to all of the prophecies of Messiah and say, it's right here. So God even then was active in solidifying this monotheistic, one God worshiping system, which was going to be necessary if the gospel, if the good news of what Jesus was going to do was going to go worldwide. There had to be a very distinct one God system. And so God used Antiochus to solidify that. So yeah, it's uncanny, and it's something that's really comforting that even when things look like they're going upside down, the Lord's still actively working. And that's comforting and it's encouraging as much as it's baffling. I don't know what you're doing, Lord, but I know you're doing something.
That's where trust comes in, huh?
Yeah. It's trust. It's realizing, man, the more I know about you, the less I know about you. Really something.
Well, I think for the Jews too, it's like you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Like they took all that stuff for granted, and then all of a sudden it was taken away. And sometimes it takes something like that to make you appreciate having it when it's been taken away.
Yeah. And they had it taken away 3 times as far as temple worship.
Yeah, but this guy took away a whole lot more.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Antiochus was really a piece of work. Okay. Any other comments, observations, questions? Still dazed and confused?
Yeah.
Actually, on the contrary, I'm less dazed and confused since we've been going through this.
It's difficult to combine all of these prophecies that deal with end times without knowing some of the background of what the images are. And kind of laying that over what happened historically. Because otherwise you got rams running around and goats killing rams and goats' horns breaking off and horns talking and boasting, and then you got leopards and lions and bears and what?
Oh my.
Yeah. You have all these things, and And so now you know why Daniel couldn't sleep.
Yeah. All that running around in his head.
Yeah, I mean, one of these places here, he says, he said, I was afraid. So Gabriel came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. And then he said, understand that the vision refers to the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. I mean, the guy couldn't get it. I think he was having a tough time sleeping with all these visions. And now Gabriel wakes him up again. Now look, I'm going to explain this to you, so you got to stay awake.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
We see all these battles and here, and Daniel talks about. Does this carry right into the 400 years before Christ?
Real close.
Yeah, that's what I can't get.
It
And
comes.
then all of a sudden we went all through the church age, and it's not mentioned, and they're talking about the Antichrist.
Well,
Yeah, that's what confuses me.
yeah. The prophecies that Daniel has, again, it's important to remember that there's dual fulfillments. Okay, there's one that has already been fulfilled, and it was fulfilled during, again, what's called the interbiblical period. And that's that period between 400, roughly 440, and 5 BC, when John entered the world. Okay, so, or actually, I'd say 27, when John began his ministry. So there was silence in between there, but in that period, that's where much of what Daniel was prophesying was fulfilled. That's when you saw this all accomplished. And most of that happened by the time of roughly 165 BC. So you're talking about just not quite 300 years in this time, but Daniel's looking forward, and he was looking at a fulfillment, that was going to be almost 400 years into the future, because he was receiving this somewhere in the mid 500s BC.
Yeah, I got that part, but then he has a vision of the 70 weeks. Will we get into that?
Yeah, we'll get into that next week.
Okay, gotcha.
We'll get into that. And that gets a little complex. That gets a little bit tricky. But we'll take a look at that. So how about that? Do we understand the little horn, the ram, the goat, the horns?
Yep.
It's all making sense? If it doesn't, you can watch the video again.
I was just going to say, I'm going to have to watch it again.
Watch it again.
Yeah,
Don't hesitate with the questions.
I know when the animals have their horns, they get their power from their horns. And when they lose their horns, they lose their power.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Absolutely right. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead then and stop the share.